Hello, thanks for listening. Just want to give a quick warning that this week's episode does talk about sexual assault and sexual violence in relation to the allegations against Diddy. So if you want to skip ahead, it's the third story in the show.
Hi, I'm Gary Young.
And I'm Carys and
Every week, Carys and I will be talking about those stories in the news that are overreported and the ones that are going completely under the radar and not talked about enough.
This is Over the Top, Under the Radar.
Carys, how you doing?
I'm all right. I have a seasonal sickness, as you may be able to hear from my voice. So I'm feeling sorry for myself. But other than that, I'm all right. How are you feeling about pumpkin spice latte season, formerly known as autumn?
You know, I like autumn. I never knew it as that. Although, is
pumpkin spice latte season?
Yeah. What? Is that Starbucks thing?
Well, yeah, originally. But, you know, everything has to be co-opted and commercialized. And so autumn officially begins when Starbucks starts selling pumpkin spice latte, which is like a syrupy flavor that I guess signifies autumn. Maybe we have different social media algorithms, but yeah, people are going big on the old PSL.
Pumpkins. Have you ever had it?
I mean, I've had it.
It's disgusting.
Yeah, it's just like a sweet syrup, cinnamon and cloves and stuff. Like, what's not to like, you know?
I can imagine that homemade. I'm not sure I want it out of a kind of industrially produced...
Out of a plastic.
Pumpkin spice latte sounds like
plastic tub with a big squirt. Yeah, has it even got pumpkin in it? You know, yeah. No shade to Starbucks. But yeah, the seasons are changing. You know, everyone coughing, making me sick, cramming onto the tube. And then you're too hot because you got your coat on and your scarf and you're underground and you got to strip it off and you miss your stop because you dropped your scarf. Oh no, I don't like this time of year at all.
Oh, wow.
Feel very crazy.
Watch out, Tiny Tim. You're going to fucking get it from Carys. Bob Cratchit, you're
Maybe
fired.
Tiny Tim made me sick. Dickhead. Yeah. Anything happening in the news you want to talk about?
I see that Kemi is still shitting the bed. I feel like someone's just got to change the sheets and call her mum and say, look, it's too much.
Yeah. Was this the autism?
Yeah, she was. I mean, talk about punching down.
Yeah, pretty unpleasant. I am genuinely fascinated about the world that she lives in and who she thinks are the most privileged people, because apparently it's autistic children. You know, that diagnosis really just opens some doors as opposed to like people who went to private school, the wealthy. Kemi Land is a real kind of upside down universe. I mean, we may have to live in it for quite some time if she wins in a couple of weeks.
I said in the last episode I'd reach peak Kemi, and I have. And I think that she knows what she's doing. She's not stupid, so she's showing off. And this is a way to keep people talking about her, and here we are talking about her. And my fear is we're now down to the last two, her and Jenrick. There was at one moment the tantalizing possibility of there being two black people as the ones that the Tories will have to choose from. I'm assuming that she will win. She's kind of saying crazy enough stuff to win, certainly. So... yeah, I may have reached peak Kemi, but I'm not sure that matters. There's going to be more Kemi to come.
We've got some lovely tweets.
Yes, from Matt Whittle on X. He gave us feedback on the last episode on White History Month. He said, this is a great provocative response to Black History Month. I'll be sharing it with undergraduate students next week in a class on Wide Sargasso Sea. That is that wonderful book written by Jean Rhys, Slavery and the Construction of Race.
It's a prequel to Jane Eyre, isn't it?
Yeah.
Sounds like a cool class, Matt.
So, Carys, what's your first offering for the week?
So I'm going to start with my under the radar, although I'd say with both of my stories for this week, I kind of could have done either as an over or an under. But this specific under the radar is about private schools and VAT. I'm guessing you're familiar with the Labour manifesto proposal. Mm-hmm. So one of Labour's headline and few policy proposals coming into the general election was that private schools, for those listening who aren't in the UK, these are schools that you have to pay for your child to attend. So state schools or comprehensive schools are free, and private schools, or confusingly public schools, cost money. Exclusive schools that you have to pay to go to in the UK currently have charitable status, which, I mean, is ridiculous. One of the benefits of the tax status that private schools have is that they don't have to pay a tax called VAT, which currently stands at 20%, I believe. So the Labour Party manifesto policy was to end private schools' VAT exemption, basically to get them to pay more tax, and that tax would go to state schools, so schools run by the local authorities and the government that you don't have to pay to attend. So broadly speaking, this was like a headline redistributive policy. People who pay to go to fancy schools are going to have to pay a bit more tax, and people who are going to normal schools that have less money will get the money that the tax is being paid for. And it's had a huge amount of airtime, partly because a lot of our political and media elite attended private schools and or are thinking about sending their children to private schools. So they tend to feel a way about the idea that the fees for those schools might go up. Something that didn't get too covered, but that was in the Observer on Sunday, is that our tax authority in the UK has said that basically, once private schools do register for VAT, they will be able to claim some tax back on capital projects. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on who you are, that means that probably the most elite private schools, so schools like Eton, might actually be eligible for money back as a result of this policy. So just to say, this isn't something that's happened. This is something that's being proposed. But in trying to work out how it works, it looks like policy that is designed to take money from the most privileged and give it to less privileged people could end up meaning that Eton get a massive tax back check. So that's my under the radar.
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, it's they're such grifters, the rich. I mean, it's really interesting because you get the dominant narrative of welfare cheats and this and that and costing the taxpayer this and that. And then you got these people who already have more and they want more. And they're always finding ways to get more because they've got the better accountants and so on and so forth.
I think for me, the thing that really jumped out is that the starting place for a lot of these elite schools and the parents that send their kids there is that they're being screwed over. And from my perspective, the starting places, they've been getting loads of perks that they don't deserve. Charitable status in the UK, obviously it functions different in different countries, but UK charities get a huge amount of tax relief, and people who donate to them get a huge amount of tax relief. And it is quite a quirky / bananas thing that schools whose mission is to educate a very small group of people so that they can be part of an elite are apparently institutions for the public benefit. So the idea that Eton is in the same tax bracket as like the RSPCA or a women's shelter or Médecins Sans Frontières, these are charities that can very clearly say how they are trying to benefit a specific group of people or even society. The starting point that these elite institutions are benefiting anyone other than the kids that go to them is quite bizarre.
I also find it really interesting when clearly rich, clearly privileged people who, in this case, are buying more privilege, right? And I know that you get some kids who go in bursaries and so on, but I mean, you wouldn't need that if it didn't bring privilege. When they start crying about unfairness, I'm like, you just bought yourself unfairness.
It's like, are you high?
Yeah, and these are the people they will talk about, not all of them, you know, they'll talk smack about affirmative action as though they are not the beneficiaries of the most obscene of affirmative action, about the best person should get the job. It's like, yeah, but the best people don't go to your school, do they? It's just the richest people who go to your school.
It really strikes me in the coverage, I'd say from all outlets, how having a sympathetic person, how having a journalist or an editor who has been to a private school or wants to send their kid to a private school, how having someone who has sympathy and empathy from that perspective really shapes the coverage. And like, would that there were that level of compassion for like Palestinians, young people, working class people. But yeah, I think the tone of this conversation is all very well, you know, this is going to be awfully difficult for a group of people. And it's like a group of people who've got loads of money. Sidebar fun fact, there is some data to suggest that one of the reasons parents send their kids to Eton is that it helps them in terms of their network and their social capital.
Oh,
So
weird.
yeah, it's not just about giving your kids a leg up, but that, you know, being part of that network might be good for business or, I don't know, fabulous parties. So yeah, I think we talk a lot about how hard the private school kiddies are going to get it, but we're not talking enough about the actual policy and tax exemptions and making sure that they are paying more money. So come on, HMRC, get on it.
Squeeze them till their pips squeak. My over the top is the undecided voters in America. There are about 8% of the vote, I think, is recorded as undecided. It's evenly split. 4% of them lean towards Harris, 4% of them lean towards Trump. It's a very close race. And so 1 or 2% either way in most places would make a huge difference. So one could look at this number and say, that's where it is. But the undecideds are not, to my knowledge and in my experience, in this case, and in the case of previous few elections, it's not people who are thinking, do I want the black woman with the migrant background who is promising abortion rights and some level of, however minor, of redistribution of wealth and of, healthcare? Or am I after the big orange monster who is an egomaniac and wants to blow people up and lock people up?
Big orange monster. I haven't heard that one.
These undecideds are more like 4% of people thinking, can I vote for Trump? He's crazy. And I can see that is a problem. And, and I can also see he's not quite there. I don't know if you saw him standing for about half an hour while they played Ave Maria, but it was bonkers. And the other 4%, particularly in places like Michigan and elsewhere, thinking, do I want to vote for a genocidal campaign that isn't really promising that much and isn't really a huge break? Now, why is this important? 2 reasons. First of all, voting started.
So yeah, Americans have not just postal votes, but early voting.
Yeah, you're able to go and cast your ballot early. It started in Georgia, which is a major swing state, earlier this week. It's starting elsewhere. The mail-in ballots have started coming in. It's very early. It's too early to tell. And I do want to put in the newsletter, there is the guy who works hard on early voting called Michael McDonald at the University of Florida, who puts up the tallies each day of where people have voted and all the information. Because in some places you can tell registered Democrats as opposed to registered Republicans. You can tell if it's black people or white people have voted. You can tell in which area that they've voted, depending on the state, which gives an indication. They've been saying that early voting has been slow up to this point, which is not great for Democrats. But then Georgia broke its record and then some over the first couple of days. So it is very early days. But it's important to know, first of all, it's really a battle for motivation more than it is to convince people, I think. Secondly, because of that, organization and data is key. There was a moment in the 2016 election where union organizers were going up to Michigan, Wisconsin, can't remember which one, and Hillary Clinton's campaign sent them back saying, we don't need you there. They sent them somewhere else, and they lost Michigan and they lost Wisconsin by very narrow margins. So you need to know where your vote is, and then you need to get it out. And that is particularly important for the Democrats because they will almost certainly win the popular vote. But in 2016, they won the popular vote, but they lost the election because they didn't get the votes in the right place. The final reason that it's really important is because the Republicans are intensifying their war on voting. The Republicans are challenging votes like never before. So it's all already kicking off.
Isn't part of the focus, though, about how tight the margin is? So that when undecideds are like 2 to 5%, they could determine the vote. Is that not why there's so much focus on them in this election? That if it was like Trump was winning by 10 points, it's like, well, it doesn't really matter if the undecideds all go for Kamala because like the margin is so big.
So I think that would be logical, but not really. If you bought into the myth of a certain nature of American democracy, where everything's to play for at the ballot box and that the rich people haven't already chosen the candidates, which they have, and that the fix isn't already in a range of ways, in the electoral college and all of its bias, then you need it not to feel like such a done deal. So then you need this kind of like, well, what can they do? Otherwise, what's it all for? What can we do to persuade you this way or the other? But there are very few persuadable people. And as I said at the beginning, it's true that because it's narrow, anything matters. So 8% of people who are undecided, that does matter. But where it goes over the top is that there is an understanding that they're undecided between the candidates, when they're actually, most of them are undecided about whether they will bother. And this is particularly true in the States because of segregation and because of racialization. For example, this was the issue in 2020 where people describe the American electoral landscape in terms of states, but actually it's more like an archipelago. It's the cities that vote Democrat by and large. I think every city that's more than 500,000 people votes Democrat. So when the votes came in 2020, and my guess is if it's close, we'll see this again, the Republican thing was, yeah, but all of these votes are from Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, and they're just cheats. And what they mean is they're black and they're brown, and we don't trust anything that comes out of there. So it means that if you can get a black woman to the polls in America, overwhelmingly chances are she's going to vote Democrat. So in the demographics and in the geography, we can see that if the targeting is powerful, similarly, if you can get a white man in rural America, you know how he's going to go more often than not.
So yeah, I think that we get a lot of conversation around people's decision and what sways them, but we don't hear a lot about turnout. And if you are involved in a political campaign, whether as a volunteer or a staffer, a lot of what you are focused on is turnout or GOTV, get out the vote. That is underreported. Also, if you understand that a bit more, then you also understand who gets favoured politically. So something that is definitely true in the UK, I think fairly true in the US and true in a lot of other democracies, is that older people tend to reliably turn out and vote. And I mean, you can sort of get on a level like maybe if you're retired, then it's a bit easier to fit voting into your day. That turnout, the fact that that turnout can be relied upon, I think really shapes how much older voters are listened to and accommodated in political life. And the fact that other groups of people tend to need a bit more effort to turn out. So young people is a great example, I think also translates into political power. Understanding that a lot of elections are won from a turnout operation is a really important part of any political or election conversation. And I agree that right now you hear more about the switcheroos.
Big shout out to the people who signed up to Patreon this week. This week's new sign-ups: Judy, Alison, Layla, Caroline, Jessie, Belinda, and Manjiri. Thanks so much to all of you.
We now have 282 Patreon supporters, and we need to get another 18 people to support us on Patreon to hit our target of 300 supporters by the end of October, which is Black History Month in the UK. Packages start at just £3 a month to support us on Patreon. So if you want the show to keep running and you also want access to our weekly bonus episodes, our weekly newsletter, the exclusive over under WhatsApp community that is always popping off, just search for Over the Top Under the Radar on the Patreon website and put your money where your ears are, as Gary likes to say. So my over the top is Diddy, Puff Daddy, P. Diddy. At one time he was called Love. We don't need to get into that. If I say Diddy, what is it that comes to mind?
See, I'm old, but I've interviewed him before. So Diddy, Sean Combs.
Oh, wow.
Kind of producer, rapper, git. And I know that recently actually for quite some time, he was Me Too'd, and it's gone exponential in terms of his alleged involvement in a series of outrageous sexual harassment, rape, sexual attack and so on. That's as much as I really know. And something about parties, some horrible parties.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm interested to hear what it was like to interview him. For the sake of the over, there are three main elements to the Diddy story that I think they're not being over-reported, but I think as a combo, they're being misreported. One, there were accusations of domestic violence from a former partner, Cassie, a singer, which were very rapidly settled out of court. And then a video surfaced of Sean Combs, Diddy, being incredibly violent to Cassie. Obviously, when there has been a settlement, you don't really have clarity on what has happened. But this video, and it's very unpleasant, I wouldn't actually recommend anyone watches it, show him being physically abusive to a now former partner. So that was the first thing that happened. The second thing that happened is there are a huge number of criminal charges that I think mostly have been brought by the Southern District of New York around sex trafficking by force, fraud or coercion, transportation to engage in prostitution. So broadly speaking, the accusations are around, as you mentioned, Gary, sex parties, I guess you might call them, called freak-offs, but also that as there was a huge, and like the scale of this, I think is what has been shocking to a lot of people. The criminal indictments are just about, on a very large scale, Combs abusing, threatening, coercing women and men, also girls and boys, to perform sexual acts, often transferring them over state lines. I mean, it's all quite grim. And, there are a few details that have really been picked up, but one was around people being put on drips because they've been so unwell or dehydrated after these sex parties, where it looks like a lot of people were being coerced or forced to perform sex acts. And then the third thing is there's a big number of civil suits. So people are alleging sexual misconduct and suing in civil court. So that's getting a lawyer, filing a lawsuit, I guess, with the hope of getting damages paid. I think that the Diddy stuff, it's not over the top, but it's being covered in a way that I think is really harmful. And he's not the only one, but I guess the reason it feels quite depressing is that we're now 7 years on from the Harvey Weinstein scandal breaking in the media. And I guess the beginning of what some people called the Me Too movement, where people used the sort of phrase that was first coined by Tarana Burke, a feminist activist. And then it sort of blew up on social media with women saying, like, me too, this has happened to me. The reason that I think the Diddy stuff has gone a bit over the top or been misreported is, first of all, it's really being covered as a celebrity story. There's a lot of getting into the salacious details. So like lots of people joking about when different premises were raided, they uncovered like loads of bottles of baby oil, like a ridiculous number, like hundreds of bottles of baby oil and lube. So like, first of all, it's being covered as a salacious celebrity story when it's actually a story about, a man who's allegedly been incredibly abusive on a huge, huge scale. So it's not just the things he's done, but the sheer number of people that have to have been complicit to cover it up. And I think the thing that has also become clear, and I'd be interested to hear your perspective, Gary, is that like Weinstein, there's been, if you're in the music industry or a little bit closer to the world of celebrity, that this has been one of those things that's been sort of known by people for quite a long time. So I think that's annoying, frustrating that 7 years on from Me Too, we're still not talking about the fact that all of this sexual violence and coercion is part of a spectrum of experiences. That was part of why women shared on social media Me Too, to say, this has happened to me, this is incredibly prevalent. And I think that's the second thing that I'm struggling with the Diddy coverage. The way that there's this kind of voyeurism, and the same thing is happening to Diddy that happened to Weinstein, which is these men are being described as like predators and monsters. And to be clear, what Weinstein did and what Diddy is accused of having done is monstrous. But part of painting these men as these extreme, like inhuman, horrible people, I think is a way of ignoring the fact that in a million small ways, there are lots of people who replicate these sorts of behaviors in and amongst us. 2 women still die every week in the UK at the hands of a current or former partner. So by finding these men who are like monstrous and awful and do all these extreme things, there's some way in which we then deny like the violence and abuse that's so common for women and girls, and a number of boys and men were allegedly victims of Diddy. We deny the reality of this violence and coercion and abuse in our everyday lives. And I think that that's a real missed opportunity. But I would love to hear about what he was like to meet, and what you thought about the story as it's been developing.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a good one. It's a horrific story. He was a bit underwhelming, actually. I mean, so I've met him and I interviewed him, and I don't, if I can find the interview, it was in 1997. And if I can find the interview, I will put it in the newsletter. Biggie was not long dead. Biggie Smalls was somebody that Puffy, as he was then called, or Sean Combs, as I think we should kind of call, I want to just call him Sean Combs now because that's his name. But anyway, Puffy, he produced Biggie. He did the song "I'll Be Missing You," and it was not long after then. There was protection. I kind of met him in somewhere in Mayfair in some kind of hotel room. My understanding of him, because I also did a documentary, BBC documentary about him when he was on trial, called "Keeping It Real." This was like once again back when Shine Barrow shot his gun in a New York nightclub, and he was, in Diddy's crew. This is when he was going out with J-Lo. My understanding of him professionally was that he was a very talented packager of talent. And my impression of him personally was that beyond that, he wasn't a particularly nice or interesting person. Couldn't really get anybody to kind of talk about why they loved him. It was more like actually kind of almost why they slightly feared him, not in a sexual sense, but in a kind of he takes very few prisoners and so on. I take your point about the kind of the description of him as a monster in a way that exceptionalizes him and forgoes the opportunity to connect what he's done to the broader range of sexual violence and predation that is out there. I'm just wondering what you think the media might do differently when what he is doing is monstrous and a description of him as a monster. How do they describe someone then who does these monstrous things in a way that takes us forward rather than backwards?
I've been thinking about it a lot because also, there are the allegations that have surfaced about Mohammed Al-Fayed, the now deceased former owner of Harrods. And I think the thing that I'm not naive, it is the sensational and eye-catching parts of stories like Diddy's or Mohammed Al-Fayed's are going to be the headline, the age of the youngest victim. I get that is shocking. I think that the level of detail of specific encounters and incidents to me feels a bit salacious and unnecessary. So I think there's an easy thing you can do on the language around Diddy and the mythologizing around him. I mean, you just did it. There's a version of this where you were like, I interviewed him and there was always this weird atmosphere around him. Everyone was afraid. And I think there's a lot of like retrofitting that on of like, well, there was just something off about him. Everyone could tell he had bad energy. So I think not using that sort of language, I think not being too voyeuristic about the details of assaults, encounters, I think are ways that we can reduce that. It's how things are reported, but it's also what is not said. If the allegations are true, in order to run an operation on this scale, there have to be dozens, if not hundreds, potentially thousands of people who are in some way complicit. Who is buying the baby oil, booking the hotel rooms, getting the drips. There's often a lack of curiosity around that. We got some of it around Weinstein, and I bring him up because I think he's the closest analog to Diddy in terms of, as well as the sexual misconduct, there's this sense of a man who is like a powerful bully and someone, and that, comes out around Diddy, like they have power in their industry. So even if they aren't coercing you or assaulting you, there's this sense of like to be scared of them. But it's like, how many people enable that? How many people make that possible? If hundreds or thousands of people are complicit in something, then that means people like us and people who are listening, like we are, if not complicit, we are witnessing or in the orbit of this stuff. And for me, the most important thing is, well, how do we spot it and stop it? Not just how do we like pick and comb over the details of like horrible events. And I was trying to think like the There's a TV show that I think does this fairly well. It's called The Morning Show. It stars Jennifer Aniston, Steve Carell, and Reese Witherspoon. And it's about a fictional Good Morning America GMTV type show where one of the main hosts gets Me Too'd. That first season is really not looking at what the guy has done, but looking at what sort of a workplace enables that to happen. And I guess that's what I'm interested in. How do you spot the signs that that guy's not just like a grumpy boss or a bit of a bully, but like he's an abuser? And I think that while we're not having those conversations, we're letting down victims.
There was I think it might have been a Facebook post or a blog post by writer Scott Rosenberg about Weinstein. Even if it wasn't the headline, the theme of it and the thing it kept going back to was everyone fucking knew. He said, we didn't know specifically about that one thing, but we knew. We all knew. In this case, he said, I didn't know the details, but I knew that stuff was going on. I was aware. And then with some candor, he says, and so why? Well, because we were in his orbit, and in his orbit was a kind of, was a glorious thing, and he could be generous and this and that. But it's not like when we heard this thing, we thought that couldn't possibly be him. And he says, I know that everybody knew because I knew.
And I think in another way, the conversations that I had with male friends that I feel like there was this window around Me Too where we could have those difficult and uncomfortable conversations, which end with a lot of us being complicit of doing nothing, or at least not have kind of following a thread. And I'm not saying that everyone involved in these sort of huge systemic examples of abuse knew, but the thing that Me Too really left me with was like asking more questions and pulling at threads. If what you see a powerful man do in public feels inappropriate or a bit icky, it's not just assuming that what you see is all that is there. What we see in these cases is the tip of an iceberg. And it's like turning that questioning part of your brain on, being like, what is going on here? And I should check in with that person. And I think that is something that's within all of our power, but it's not something that we are drawing out of these scandals if we're just focusing on the kind of salaciousness. There is a whole spectrum of violence. On that spectrum are these smaller, lesser acts of buying someone a few extra drinks because you think it'll be more likely that they'll sleep with you, making comments to someone on the street, constantly talking about what female colleagues are wearing or whether you want to sleep with them. And like, these are the things that are in our lives and our universes that we have control over. And I guess for me, what is the point of these scandals if we aren't doing that reflection?
My under the radar is about Portugal. And in Portugal, it's a centre-right government, interestingly, although this is a law that they've taken over, an idea they've taken over from the previous centre-left government. They're saying that young people who earn up to 28,000 euros a year, that's about £23,500, will have 100% tax exemption in their first year of work, dropping to 75% tax exemption for their second year to their fourth year, and then 50% between the fifth and seventh year. Basically, they are giving young people a break, a tax break in this instance. And the motivation for doing that is there's something of a generational brain drain in Portugal. A significant number of younger people, particularly those who are qualified and can, are leaving. This is to try and keep them there. At the end of September, so not that long ago, thousands of young people protested in Lisbon and elsewhere in Portugal against huge rent rises and house prices. This is, to me, not just a Portugal problem, although I'm impressed by that as a response to that problem, which is the issue of the generational wealth gap. So we are in a moment where people of my age and around my age, they like to talk shit about millennials and the kind of avo toast and sense of entitlement, while at the same time absolutely underfunding their future and taking away from them the rights and opportunities they had. In Britain, the number of people living with their parents jumped 15% between 2011 and 2021. Some of that's about COVID, but that was a trend. Most university students now be paying 9% of their income. And home buyers under the age of 35, most of them now rely on their parents to buy their house. And that speaks to the other thing, as well as the massive generational gap. There is also the fact that it is compounding and amplifying inequalities. If your parents went to university and they own their own homes, you're 6 times more likely to get money from them than if your parents rented. We are in a period where to those who have much or some, more will be given. To those who have little or less, you're on your own. I think it's sordid and dangerous and awful. And I'm inspired that in Portugal, at least they are coming up with something to put some money on the table. There was one article in The Guardian, I hadn't seen it mentioned anywhere else. This was, to me, a way of talking about the generational wealth gap without just moaning about it. There are things that we can do.
I love this. This is a great under. I hadn't heard about it. You know, I love a good tax policy. And I also like that we're bookending the episode with some tax interventions.
You're such a nerd.
I am a nerd. I'm happy to admit that. I love it. Also, it's a really straightforward, non-complicated tax policy, right? It's for all young people and it gives all of them the same incentive. We get a lot of think pieces and, you know, social media content about intergenerational warfare, but like there are some really simple things we could do to start fixing the balance. And I think the reality when governments don't act is that there is only one type of redistribution that will happen, which is from already rich people to their children. It really is the rich get richer, or at least their kids experience a lot more privilege. So yeah, it's a huge injustice. I'm sure loads of us have experience of it. And I'm not saying that this policy of people paying a bit less income tax deals with all of the injustices. I don't know how you recompense people for climate change, for example. But yeah, I think like it's not that hard to start to address the inequity between generations, and that there are probably half a dozen other policies like this that a government could enact tomorrow if they really cared about it.
One of the things which does come back to the, in a way, to the thing about undecideds and the US vote and identifying the vote is, and I'm not one of those people who thinks, well, if you don't vote, then you can't say anything. And that voting, you know, is that great line that was the title of one of Ken Livingstone's books. If voting changed anything, they'd abolish it. So without wanting to fetishize the franchise, which is important and yet insufficient, if there is something to vote for and you were so inclined, I want to kind of urge young people, if not to vote, just to get involved. This is not something where we are helpless. And it matters to me that in Portugal, there were these demonstrations in September, that there was pressure put on the government. Power, as I've said a few times before on this podcast, the words of Frederick Douglass, the abolitionist, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. So you have to make the demands. You have to make them where you think it's relevant. Could be in the street, could be at a polling booth, could be both, could be somewhere else. But where it's least effective is just sounding off on Twitter and TikTok.
Yeah, I think I don't want to put it all on young people. Like, I think that, yes, it's important to organise. And a lot of the things that have screwed over younger generations are not things that you could have like voted away. They're huge socioeconomic trends. And so, yes, organise, challenge the received wisdom that young people don't vote, so they're not real political stakeholders. And I don't know, maybe move to Portugal, like maybe vote with your feet. There is an onus on young people, but more than that, I think there's an onus on policymakers. Like, at least, you know, start to address the imbalance and like start to try. I'm sure this policy isn't going to be perfect, but the idea that like it's too hard for us to even try, I think is the thing I struggle with. And also tax these, I don't know if you're a boomer, Gary, or a Gen X, but tax the boomers, tax the Gen X's.
I'm not a boomer. I'm 5 years into the one after the boomers, but
Gen X. You're a Gen X. You're Gen X.
Okay.
Apathetic.
Okay.
You know, like Smashing Pumpkins, sort of, you know, I don't know. You benefited, but it's not as much as the boomers.
Yeah. We start with pumpkins and we end with pumpkins.
Well, it's pumpkin spice latte season, guys.
So I'm told.
Thank you for listening to Over the Top, Under the Radar. Remember to like, subscribe, and leave a positive review wherever you get your podcasts.
You can sign up to our newsletter at overunderpod.com.
If you want to support the show, you can find us by searching Over the Top, Under the Radar on Patreon, and we would really appreciate it if you gave us a gift.
And connect with us on socials at over__under_pod__.